They said the war was over. They said the ceasefire had held. They were wrong. In the early hours of June 7th, 2026, missiles streaked across the night sky over Israel once again. Air raid sirens tore through cities that had barely begun to breathe. Millions of people ran for shelters, people who had been told just weeks earlier that the worst was behind them. But someone, somewhere, had made a decision that the world was not yet ready for peace. And the question that nobody could answer, the question that intelligence agencies in 3 countries were scrambling to understand, was not whether Iran had fired. Iran had confirmed it. The question was, what did they know that we didn't? Because this was not random. Nothing in this conflict has ever been random. To understand what happened on June 7th, you have to go back, not months, but years. You have to understand a country that the world has consistently misread, a nation that has been sanctioned, bombed, isolated, and declared finished more times than anyone can count, and that keeps emerging from the wreckage with a clenched fist and a plan that nobody outside Tehran fully understands. Iran is not a simple story, and anyone who tells you it is hiding something. For decades, the Islamic Republic built its military doctrine around a single, unshakable principle that Iran would never again fight a conventional war on its own territory the way it did against Iraq in the 1980s. That war cost Iran nearly 500,000 lives. It lasted 8 years. It ended in a draw that felt like a defeat. And the men who survived it, the commanders of the Revolutionary Guard, the strategists in the IRGC's most secretive planning divisions, made a vow: never again. Never again would Iran stand still and absorb punishment without the capacity to reach out and touch its enemies wherever they stood. What they built over the next 40 years was not an army in the traditional sense. It was something more dangerous, more patient, more deliberately designed to confuse, outlast, and exhaust any adversary that dared to challenge it. They built a missile arsenal that didn't just threaten Israel, it threatened every American base in the region. It threatened Gulf state infrastructure. It threatened the global flow of oil through a narrow waterway that the entire world economy depends on. They built it underground. They built it dispersed. They built it so that no single strike, no matter how precise, no matter how powerful, could eliminate it all. And then they waited. For years, Western analysts looked at Iran's behavior and saw provocation, saw aggression, saw a rogue state acting outside the norms of international conduct. But there was another way to read the same evidence, a way that the classified assessments of certain European intelligence services had been quietly documenting for nearly a decade. What if Iran wasn't being aggressive? What if Iran was executing, step by step, year by year, a deterrent strategy that was written before most of the current world leaders were in power? What if Iran had always known this day would come and had spent 40 years preparing for it? That question was still unanswered when the war began in February 2026, and it became considerably more urgent when the war didn't end the way its architects expected. The initial Israeli and American strikes were devastating by any conventional military measure. Nuclear facilities were hit, air defense networks were degraded, command and infrastructure in and around Tehran was struck with a precision that in any previous conflict in history would have signaled the beginning of the end for the targeted nation. Senior military commanders were killed, communications were disrupted, the country's airspace was shut down. By every metric that military planners used to assess damage, by every model that had been built in the war rooms of Tel Aviv and Washington, Iran should have been reeling. But something wasn't adding up. Because within days, not weeks, not months, Iran was firing back. not with the desperate, disorganized salvos of a military on the edge of collapse, with coordinated, multi-wave ballistic missile attacks that demonstrated command and control functions that were not destroyed, with drone operations that suggested logistics networks that were still intact, with proxy activations across Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen that spoke to a command architecture that had survived the strikes far better than the models had predicted. Someone inside Iran had built a redundancy into their military machine that even the most sophisticated Western intelligence had not fully mapped. And here is the detail that was never fully explained in any press conference. Here is the question that defense analysts were asking behind closed doors in Washington throughout the spring of 2026. How much of what Iran was doing in those first weeks of the conflict was pre-planned? How much of the response had been scripted in advance, rehearsed, prepared, ready to execute before the first Israeli bomb ever fell? Because if Iran genuinely anticipated the strike, if they knew, not just suspected, but knew, then the entire strategic calculation of the conflict changes. It means Iran chose to absorb the initial blow. It means they let the strike happen because they had calculated that the political and military costs of the retaliation would outweigh the damage they suffered. It means they were playing a longer game than anyone was willing to publicly acknowledge. By April 2026, both sides were exhausted. The human cost had been staggering. Iranian cities had absorbed damage that the state media was systematically underreporting. Israeli civilians had spent weeks cycling between bomb shelters and a surface-level normalcy that felt increasingly fragile. The global economy was registering the shock of a conflict that had disrupted energy markets, terrified investors, and begun to create political crises in countries that had no direct role in the conflict and no power to stop what was happening on their own territory. Trump brokered a ceasefire. It was announced with the kind of triumphant language that American presidents tend to deploy when they want to claim ownership of a diplomatic outcome. Both sides, with different degrees of enthusiasm, agreed to halt operations. Iran halted first, Israel followed 12 hours later, after a final set of strikes that Tehran called a blatant violation of the terms, and Washington called a measured response to prior Iranian activity. The ceasefire was declared. The missiles went quiet. But quiet is not the same as peace, and in the Middle East, in 2026, nobody who had been paying attention believed for a single moment that the silence was anything other than a pause. Because Israel did not stop striking Lebanon. This is the thread that connects everything. This is the detail buried beneath the headlines about ceasefire negotiations and diplomatic progress and Trump's claims of total victory. While the formal ceasefire with Iran was in place, while negotiators in Vienna and back channels in Oman were working on framework agreements, Israeli military continued to operate in Lebanon, continued to strike Hezbollah targets, continued to hit infrastructure in a country whose government had no formal role in the conflict and no power to stop what was happening on their own territory. And Iran had been explicit, unambiguous, stated it publicly and privately. If Israeli strikes in Lebanon continued, Iran would consider the ceasefire void, not weakened, not strained, void. On June 5, 2026, Israeli aircraft struck targets in South Lebanon in operations that the IDF described as necessary and targeted. Lebanon's health ministry described the aftermath differently. 5 people were killed in Tyre. Among the wounded were 4 paramedics. The strike occurred near a Red Cross facility. Iran watched, Iran calculated, and then Iran acted.
The missiles that launched towards Israel on the night of June 7th were not fired in rage, they were not fired in panic, they were fired with the cold, deliberate logic of a military establishment that had stated its red line clearly, had watched it crossed, and had decided that credibility, the credibility of a nation that says what it means, was worth more than the comfort of a ceasefire that was only being observed by one side. But here is the mystery deepens. Here is where the story becomes something darker than a simple exchange of strikes. In the hours before Iran fired, there were signals, intelligence signals, communications intercepts, movement patterns at IRGC facilities that the American surveillance architecture in the region, the satellites, the signals intelligence, the human sources that survived the war should have been tracking. And according to reporting that emerged in the days following the attack, some of that data existed in systems that American analysts had access to. Was there a warning that didn't travel fast enough through the chain of command? Was there an assessment that was made and then discarded or deprioritized or buried under the weight of 100 competing intelligence requirements? Or, and this is the question that no official statement has yet addressed directly, was the warning seen and was a decision made about what to do with it that has not been publicly disclosed? We don't have the answer to that question. The documents that would answer it are classified. The people who know are not talking.